Elections are some of the most prevalent things in our lives. People don't vote for just president and parliament, but for governor, mayor, class representative, and so on. However, in our elections, there is a key element, the voting method. In elections with greater than 2 candidates, there can be a variety of different voting methods used. Let's start with our current method, plurality voting. We can start with the 2000 U.S. presidential election. Everybody was already having a real headache in this election with the Florida results, and we can see what led to the election of George Bush in this pie chart. There was a group of people that liked Al Gore, but liked Ralph Nader even more. However, plot twist, humans are smart. They were like, what if we just vote for Gore instead of Nader, because Nader can't actually win. However, not everybody did that, and this result happened. Now let's look at polarization, which is definitely a real word. In this helpful diagram for maximum voting, we can see that any attempt at appealing to the center of their opinion cannot win elections because it is squeezed in the center between the two more polarized candidates. Oh well, at least they tried. So, if any attempt at getting a new contender fails because everybody's too scared, then we have a two-party system. So maybe we could try instant runoff voting, which is called ranked choice voting now, but I'm going to use IRV throughout the video because there are other ranked voting methods and I would not want to cause confusion. And so this is another option, which is used sometimes. You ranked at least one candidate, and you can stop at any time and submit an incomplete ranking of candidates. Although in the U.S. elections that use it, you can only usually rank up to 3 or 5 candidates. Then the votes go in rounds. The person with the least first place votes keeps getting eliminated in every round, and the elections are rerun with that candidate eliminated until one remains. So we can look at real world elections that use the system, so we can see if we solved voting. Unfortunately, we can see that in the real world countries that use it, there are still 2 parties, not counting single transferable vote. For example, the Australia lower house is almost entirely 2 parties. So why are there still 2 parties? Well, there's a problem called the center squeeze effect. Using the same diagram, we can see that the center candidates that appeal to popular opinions still get eliminated first. And so a real world example of this could be seen in the 2022 Alaskan special election for House. Nick Bayek came in the last first round votes and was eliminated early, resulting in Sarah Palin losing to Mary Peltola. However, Bayek would have won easily to Peltola and was more favored than Palin head-to-head. He was what was called a Condorcet winner, but despite that title, he did not win the election. Had Palin voters switched to voting Bayek first over Palin, they would have gotten a better result from their perspective. And we know that this would be better from their perspective because when we look at the ballot data, they favor Bayek over Peltola. So a big strategy problem still exists in IRV. In addition, there's another problem with IRV, and it's that it's not precinct summable. So individual counties cannot report individual results. And last time I checked, 150 million people cannot fit into a single room. So each county would have to give full ballot data to a central source. So that could lead to a lot of security problems if one singular source has to tally the entire election. We can also look at these two systems through something called the equal vote criterion, which is a good test on whether a voting method is equal. So you can imagine a voter and an evil version of the voter that votes the opposite for all the candidates. So You can vote in such a way that the evil version of you is canceled out, thus making your votes equal by canceling each other out. So, however, in plurality, you can only vote for one candidate, so you cannot cancel his vote. For example, in the 2000 election, if somebody votes Bush, then you can't completely counteract their vote because you can only vote for Gore or you can vote for Nader. And so then that's basically leading to a vote against a candidate. So what about IRV? And unfortunately, you will still not be able to cancel the vote. One way to look at how voting is unequal is by seeing how candidates are eliminated. When you vote A over B over C, if B gets eliminated, then A, it would transfer to C. Same as if you have voted A over C over B. So your preference for B over C is not shown. And this is because since B was eliminated early and prematurely in the first round, your vote skips from A straight to C, almost like you never voted B. So, if neither of these systems can guarantee an equal vote, what can? Well, there's something called approval voting. Approval voting was invented recently in the 1970s. This is a voting system that has the equal vote criterion. Here's how it works. So you're still allowed to vote for one candidate, but you're allowed to vote up to as many candidates as you want. In particular, there is no total limit to the amount of candidates you can vote. You can't vote the same candidate more than once, and your vote is not split between approved candidates. Each candidate gets one vote. So, in addition, in St. Louis, they implemented a system where there used to be a partisan primary and a plurality general election. But they replaced it with an approval nonpartisan primary to a runoff between the two candidates with the most votes in the nonpartisan primary as a separate election. Now, what properties does approval voting have? Well, approval voting passes something called favorite betrayal criterion. If one candidate is your favorite, there will be never a reason not to vote on. In addition, if you have an honest ranking of candidates, best to worst, it is in your strategic interest to draw a line and say everybody above this line gets approved and everybody below doesn't. Like you're adjusting hurdle for candidates to cross. Now with the candidate in the center and candidates to the left and right, both supporters of the left and right candidates will approve the center candidate and the centrist wins. Now one concern that people might bring up is that it might lead to one centrist party winning every election. However, centrist is not the same as center of popular opinion. Places can and will change their ideology all the time, and whichever party represents the general will of the people at that time will win. And that will not always be the same party, or more specifically, the candidate. Now, we could also look at how you express your ballot compared to ranked voting. While some might say how ranking a ballot is more expressive, we can see how in IRV some rankings aren't paid attention to, but also that approval can show a cardinal preference. So what is that even? Approval is a cardinal or a scored system because you score each candidate 0 or 1. And this lets an extra opinion be placed depending on the placement of the threshold. For example, in a ranked system, if you voted A over B over C, B could be almost as good as A or almost as bad as C. However, it would never communicate that in your vote. But in approval voting, you will be allowed to vote for B, and if you think it's almost as good as A. However, if you think B is really bad, then you can only vote for A. And so this shows whether you think B is a good candidate rather than just which candidates it's between. And of course, like I said, approval voting follows the equal vote criterion. If an evil version of yourself votes some candidates, you can vote all the candidates they didn't vote, and it will equal one approval for every single candidate, which will not affect the election. Another way to look at this is see how these methods hold up in simulations. So there have been many voting method simulations. However, one called the voter satisfaction efficiency was run of various voting methods, around 15 of them. It would work by giving voters abstract utility values for each candidate, basically showing how much they like them. Then they would vote for their simulated, accordingly to their simulated utility values that showed how much they liked them. And then compare the best candidate by just looking at how much they like them, and then looking at the elected candidate that was chosen and seeing how they differ. Now it sees how good that voting method was if it was compared to the average candidate. Now it's only time to repeat this process millions of times, and now there is an average of tons of different scenarios that voting methods could be placed in. And this is the final result. Ignoring the mean that is board account, we can just look at this simpler diagram of a few voting methods. First, our current method has a score of 73%. However, if people strategize their votes, it will rise to an 86%, likely because people just choose between the front runners of the election instead of splitting the votes between minor candidates. Under approval voting, with honest voters, it is an 87.5, and strategy actually rises approval voting to a 94%. Finally, IRV with honest voters looks good at a 91.3%, but when people try to strategize their votes, it goes to a 79.7%. So, in addition, in all three of these systems, strategy is rewarded on an individual level. So, if people strategize their votes, IRV might end up being the worst, and approval voting the best system. So currently, I've only talked about these three systems. However, what about STAR? It looks better than approval, and in fact, STAR voting and Condorcet systems beat approval in this metric. However, there's one element of voting that I have not talked about yet, and that's the simplicity of the voting method. Approval voting is basically the simplest voting method possible, as even simpler than plurality, as there's no way to spoil your ballot unless you left it blank, voted for every candidate, or scribbled all over it. So this is important for voting, because simplicity will make reform campaigns for approval voting easier for people to understand, and so approval voting will get less skepticism and a greater chance of passing. And so the approval ballot will be easier to understand for people as ranked systems. People might have a hard time understanding how to vote. And again, there is no way to spoil your ballot. However, more than just that, approval voting is simple enough to work on every single voting machine. Well, touchscreen and online voting, like in Estonia, could support any voting method. A lot of machines are hard-coded for plurality. However, any plurality machine can run approval voting. Since they run elections and contests, for example, in presidential election years, you might be voting for president and a member of Congress. Each candidate can be in their own contest. So basically saying the one candidate is their own election, and approve and disapprove would be the quote-unquote candidates for the contest. So then you could see the approvals and disapprovals of every candidate. However, even simpler to use than that is that also a lot of plurality machines have an option to vote for up to a certain number of candidates, like they do for school board with a limited number of votes. So the machines could be modified to vote up to the total number of candidates. And hand counting on paper ballots would be very easy for approval voting compared with other methods. And finally, outside of governmental elections, it is really easy to count by raising hands, as there's no need to check if somebody raised their hand twice. So now one major concern that people have with approval voting is the worry that voters would be incentivized to vote only for their favorite, called bullet voting, all the time. And then this would revert to plurality as more and more people vote this way. However, we can see that they would not vote this way all the time, and only in certain scenarios. First, we can see that given no information about which candidates are viable or not, a simulation was run on the average benefits on voting a certain way. And in the worst case, with 3 candidates, bullet voting was the best strategy, given that there are less than 10 voters. But wait, what about when voters can see and respond to poll data? Will they vote then? Well, there's a theorem that says when voters respond to polls and strategically vote, an honest Condorcet winner will always be elected if one exists. I explained this before, but a Condorcet winner is a winner that will be any other candidate if there were just that candidate and the other in that election. So that means that approval under this strategy is a Condorcet system and not a plurality system. A funny thing about this is that some actual ranked Condorcet methods based around electing the Condorcet winner, people strategize and might not elect the Condorcet winner all the time. So, approval voting won in a competition it wasn't even meant to be tested in. Interesting. Well, back to bullet voting. How bad is it if people implement this strategy anyway, ignoring whether they have the motivation to do it? In the voter satisfaction efficiency simulation, VSC was tested if a random 60% of voters tried the bullet voting strategy, and the results were actually better than normal approval. They only start to dip down after 70% of voters bullet vote. So what about real-world data? Well, in Fargo, North Dakota's mayoral election recently, 60% of voters voted for one candidate, according to an estimate. However, according to the poll, an estimated third of those voters were out of strategy, and the other only really liked one candidate. So around 20% of these were actual bullet votes. In addition, in St. Louis, Missouri, in the 4-candidate primary election before the runoff, an average of 1.6 candidates were approved, which is very good. In addition, in the Fargo, North Dakota's election for the council, they voted an average of 3 candidates, which was greatly improving the winning percentages of the winners. So we can see that bullet voting is not the dominant strategy in the city election using it. Now, as you can see from Fargo, North Dakota, bullet voting will sometimes work and sometimes not. An ideal three-candidate election, 50% of votes will vote for one person. And if you strategize, you're going to vote the other way. So of all strategic votes, half of them will be bullet votes, and half of them will expand their vote to two candidates. Bullet voting is not a good strategy all the time. Bullet voting is good if your favorite candidate is one of the front runners, aka has a major chance of winning. But if your favorite has a little chance, it would be wise to vote for a front runner too. Back to 2000, Nader supporters would have to vote Gore as well if they wanted him to be George Bush. And obviously, voting only for Gore would not make any sense at all. So far, this video has been about single winner elections. What about multi-winner elections? For example, for a 5-winner election, you could just choose the top 5 approval votes. But then there would be a problem. Suppose 10 candidates are running, 5 from Party A and 5 from Party B. Party A has 60% support, Party B has 40% support. So if you just chose simple approval voting for the top 5 votes, you would get all 5 from Party A, but Party B would get no representation, even though 40% of voters like them. However, a proportional method could be used. There are different ways you can get approval to be proportional, and while there are much more accurate ways to do it, sequential proportional approval voting is the simplest way to make a proportional approval voting system. In every round, the candidate with the most votes gets elected. And if the candidate you voted for got elected, then your vote would be re-rated to count half as much. Then if it happens again in another round, for a different candidate that you voted for got elected, it would count 1/3, and then 1/4, and then so on. For elections with just a few positions, simply using the proportional approval voting method would work. But in places like the House district, you couldn't elect 435 people just in one mega election. So districts are used. This method would use multi-member districts, mega districts, that would elect around 5 members each. However, the House would not be with 5 times as many members. It would stay at 435. Districts with 5 members would be 5 times as large. So how can we get approval voting in the real world? Well, we don't need to work on the national level now. We can reform our towns, our student governments, our votes between friends for now. Currently, we have approval voting in 2 cities, Fargo, North Dakota, and St. Louis, Missouri. And there's a statewide campaign to try to get approval voting in the state of Missouri. In conclusion, approval voting. Voting, the approval, the voting. Vote the vote. The vote voting. The voting vote approval. The vote